Introduction, Robin Wright from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, well known from endless television appearances. I saw her last night on MSNBC. In fact, I watch MSNBC so I can listen to Robin Wright speak. So please help me welcome Robin Wright.
Thanks. We're actually running out of time, so I'm going to be very brief. I will, in some ways, be a discussant to what Rashada said. I want to say something about this event and why it's special to me. There are two men in this room who I profiled a generation ago, Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi and Abdul Karim Soroush from Iran. And I wrote about the ideas of Islam and democracy having a common goal, common threads. And I remember at the time that people were deeply skeptical. And I think we've seen in the ideas of both men, in the ideas and some of the activities in both countries in that intervening 2 decades, the kind of potential there is. I'd also say that I am deeply concerned about this country because I think that there are a lot of things we in the United States aren't keeping up with when it comes to change in the region. That 2 years later, there are many, many trends that we are not addressing either adequately or imaginatively enough. I had a longer list of them, but in the name of time, I will scale them back to just 6 points. The first trend that concerns me a great deal, and which I think we're not fully addressing, is the fact that even though 120 of the Arab world's 350 million people are today either in the process of transition or struggling for transition, and that accounts, as I said, for 1/3 of the Arab world's people, that there are also today more people who are afraid of democracy than they were in the beginning of change at the end of 2010. That there is so much turmoil and uncertainty. 2 years of limbo has taken a terrible toll and has undermined the idea of democracy. When you see not only what's happened in Iraq during the decade of U.S. intervention, but the fact that even when the Arabs took it on their own terms, that has produced a kind of Darwinian struggle for survival in many of these countries. And that the United States has not been very thoughtful, very imaginative in trying to nurture, in giving voice to those, trying to help reconcile the deepening polarization within these countries, whether it's between Islamists and secular parties, whether it's among Islamists themselves. So I'm deeply concerned that the kind of fear of democracy, the uncertainty of the future, will lead to what I call the Hugo Chavez model, where in Venezuela, the first of the Latin American countries to become democratic, we saw the democratic election of a former strongman who had once engaged in an attempted military coup against a democratic regime. My great fear is that we'll have so much uncertainty, so much fear, that people will look to new Hugo Chavez's to lead their countries back into secure environments. The second is that in every single country in transition, they are in worse economic shape than they were under the autocratic regimes. I was in Sidi Bouzid a year ago, and I went to the street corner where Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. And I said to the street vendors who had taken his place, "So what do you think now?" And they all said variations of the same thing. "We have far more freedoms and far fewer jobs." And they kept reminding me that it was not the desire to vote for a liberal Democratic Party that had led them to challenge, to go on the streets. It was for the social dignity of a job and survival. And these basic instincts. We may be in principle supporting entrepreneurs, but we're not being imaginative in creating small and medium-sized industries, in fostering an environment that will address those basic concerns. The third issue that concerns me a great deal is the proliferation of democracy to the point that there's almost too much. And it plays out in something that's quite striking in each country in transition. And and that's the number of parties. Sheikh Ghanouchi told me earlier today that Tunisia now has 170 parties. Staggering in a country of 10 million people. In Libya, when they went to vote a year ago for the 200 seats of the GNC, there were 80 seats allocated for parties. 130 parties ran for those 80 seats. When it came to the 120 seats allocated for individuals, over 3,000 individuals ran for those 120 seats. In every one of the new democracies, we're finding this culture of me, 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 me. There's not a culture of us yet. There is one half of democracy in the sense of entitlements, but there's not that other half of democracy that underscores responsibility. And this again is an area in which the United States, whether it's through our academics or our think tanks, in the outreach to communities, could do far more in fostering that sense of responsibility, teaching what the idea of common good and compromise, because the idea of having 170 parties in Tunisia, 60 parties in Egypt, 130 parties in Libya is just not viable long term. The fourth issue is quite obvious, and that's the issue of security and militias. Libya has today, born in just 8 months of an uprising, over 300 militias. Some of them are working together with the new government, but none of them are really giving up their arms. Today there are estimates that in Syria there are between 200 and 2,000 militias. Obviously some of them small neighborhood groups that fall under larger rubrics. But this is an area where, again, the United States could be doing so much more. My friend Chris Stevens, who is the ambassador in Libya, had a wonderful idea of the United States providing 5,000 visas to Libyans, bringing some of the militia leaders over and taking them to local police stations to show them what the rule of law means in a local sense. Bringing members of the nascent politicians over to teach them about what a city council does, how it functions. And then, in other cases, teaching new types of vocations. And then creating ambassadors that could go back to Libya and help in the country which had the longest single rule under 42 years of Muammar Gaddafi. The tragedy is that idea died with Chris Stevens. And now, because of the insecurity, the United States is very wary about engagement in Libya, and of course, the very idea of going back to Benghazi, where Chris was deeply loved. I had been planning my trip to Libya last fall with Chris, just a week before he died. And when I did eventually get to Libya, I was struck by how many people talked about Chris as a model of American diplomacy. And one of the militia leaders at the Supreme Security Council committee said to me, you know, I began to understand that maybe my country could go back to normalcy when I saw Chris Stevens jog by our headquarters every morning. You know, this kind of stuff makes a huge difference. The fifth area is corruption. And this is what deeply concerns me. The dirty little secret of the democratic transitions is that corruption is often worse in many of these countries than they were under the autocrats. I had a cabinet minister in Libya say to me, we used to have one Muammar Gaddafi. Today we have 6.5 million. When you look at the kind of aid that's going across the border into Syria and the amount that is ripped off, whether it's by the tribal mafioso or by those who have their own political or economic agendas. This is again an area in which the United States can help teach accountability and transparency. Two more, very quickly. One is, as a woman, I'm deeply concerned about, and that's the fact that these democratic transitions have not been good for women. Whether it's in eliminating the quota in Egypt or the issue of insecurity. This is something that's not It has nothing to do with the Arab world or the Islamic world. This happens in democratic transitions. In Eastern Europe, the number of women in Romania in parliament went from 40% down to 3% after the transition from communist rule. This is a period where women are not encouraged, and this is an area in which the United States particularly could have so much more difference. And the last one I want to mention is something that I think is critical in and again, it's something that we don't talk about very much, in part out of the fear of what it could mean. And that is that the borders created by the West a century ago probably will not hold, that the map of the Middle East itself is likely to change, whether it is through soft partition or decentralization, federalization, or outright secession, particularly when it comes to Syria, Iraq, and potentially some of the Gulf countries. That we need to think very carefully when it comes to the next day, the morning after, about what the new map will look like, and try to help people understand how do you make everyone feel as if they are empowered, not just those who were excluded before, but everybody. Changing the map of the Middle East will make the democratic transitions and the process that's happened within countries look easy by comparison. And I think, again, this is where the United States is being still very reactive and not very proactive about these broader themes. I wish we were doing more. I wish we were more creative. I wish we had more resources. But this is, again, where even though we all know that there will be no Marshall Plan, we also know that we have the capabilities to do a lot more than we're doing right now. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.